Greetings and welcome to the Nomura Economics podcast. And on today's podcast, we have our chief US economist, Lou Alexander. And on this podcast, we'll be talking about Trump's 100-day anniversary that's coming up. We'll talk about some of the upcoming events in DC, in particular the supposed tax proposals or recommendations, and also the government shutdown possibilities. But before all of that, we're going to talk about the US economic outlook. So Lou, one of the big challenges this year has been to grapple with the fact that survey data in the US has been signaling a very strong growth outlook for the US, yet at the same time, hard data, the actual sort of real data speak, has diverged from that. So where do you stand on that divergence, and what does it mean for the outlook in the quarter or two ahead?
Yeah, I think we're skeptical that surge in the survey-based data is going to lead to notably higher spending, in part because what we think is driving it. One of the things that's clear is there's a very sort of partisan tinge to the sentiment data. You see this certainly in the consumer surveys, where you can break it out by Republican and Democrats, and Republicans are much more optimistic, and Democrats are much more pessimistic. And so in some sense, improvement in the headline, beneath that there are some details that raise questions about it. You see similar odd trends in the business data. So for example, in our small business survey, you see that when you ask businesses about what they're doing themselves, you see a kind of steady improvement in recent years and a modest boost since the election. But when you ask them about the environment, general business conditions, things like that, you see these very strong improvement. We think that's also driven by sort of partisan assessments, and so we're skeptical about it. And moreover, the actual data on things like consumer spending have underperformed. You haven't seen a strong connection between higher consumer confidence and higher spending. Similarly, on the business side, we have yet to see some real surge in business capital spending or something like that. And as long as that's the case, we are going to remain somewhat skeptical. Now, having said that, look, the underlying fundamentals for the U.S. economy are not bad. Obviously, you've had strong employment growth, which means strong income growth. And so we're not talking, a recession or severe downside. We're just skeptical that that we should accept some big acceleration in growth
and on
in the wake of the election.
Political sort of the polarization, you could say, in those surveys. Have we had that before? Is this a new phenomenon, or does this always happen in the first few months after the inauguration of a new president?
We have seen this before, and you have seen a similar pattern. So it is a sort of well-understood thing that people's assessments of the economy are actually affected by their partisan political views. What's different about this case is how extreme it is. So when you look at those differences this time, they're just much starker than we've seen before. That's the real difference.
Okay, that seems to be a general factor in most things that are going on in the US at the moment. Now, this week, we're in the final week of April. The recess for DC or congressman has passed, and we have a couple of events this week. So President Trump is likely to announce at least the outlines of his tax agenda on Wednesday, and then later this week we have the continuing resolution vote, which should allow the government to be funded for the subsequent subsequent sort of period. So in terms of both of those events, I mean, what do you expect for both of those?
So on the tax announcement, we are expecting Trump to announce general principles for what he would like to see in terms of tax reform. The one specific thing that has come out is lowering the corporate tax rate all the way down to 15%. To some extent, this is in line with what he talked about during the campaign. And the thing I would stress is a couple of things. First of all, it's only going to be very general principles. We are not going to get some sort of detailed tax proposal. It's pretty clear that they're not ready to provide that. Number two, one should not assume that just because they propose it, it's going to happen. What he is going to propose, I think, is at odds with certain principles that Congress is going to approach. In particular, the potential deficit impact of lowering the corporate tax rate that far, I think, is very large. And so I'm skeptical that we're going to look up after we get that announcement.
I mean, do you think he would remove certain deductions and things like that to balance the books, or would it just be kind of a headline-grabbing announcement like just a cut in taxes?
So no doubt they're going to have to reduce some deductions. The whole notion of this is going to be lower the rate and broaden the base.
Okay.
But frankly, he can't do it, broaden the base enough if you're going to try and bring the corporate rate down that far.
Okay.
Now, on the spending side, the current deadline, the current authority expires on Friday. And we are expecting that we're not going to have some sort of extended shutdown. It's possible that they might not get it done on Friday, but they get it done over the weekend. It's also possible that we get a temporary extension, so say, for example, of 1 week, so that they can finish this up over a little longer horizon. But the notion that we get an extended shutdown over this, I think, is reasonably unlikely. The president has indicated over the last 24 hours that he is prepared to give on some of the sticking points, in particular funding of the border wall. Look, until it's done, this is going to remain an uncertainty, and I would put the chances of some more extended shutdown as something like, 1 in 5 or something like that at this point. It's certainly not zero, but I don't think it's the central case.
Okay. And obviously the other big event, well, I'm not sure if you can call it an event, is we're coming up to the 100-day mark for the presidency. Now, if you look back yourself at over the past 100 days, and this is in relation to the administration's impact on the economy, what has surprised you relative to what you thought was going to unfold before the inauguration?
So one thing I would say is on the trade side, I think they have generally been more moderate than one might have expected coming in. There really haven't been big, broad-based disruptive announcements on trade. We had just this week an announcement of an action against softwood imports from Canada, which is the first real individual trade case they've brought. But when you, I think, broadly look at what they've done on the trade side, yes, they sort of got out of TPP. Yes, they sort of initiated the process of renegotiating NAFTA. But in general, that has been less disruptive than I would have thought. That's number one.
Okay.
Number two, on the deregulation side, it's been pretty much what we've expected. Those things will take a while to really feel their effects, but I think you can argue he's kind of done a version of what he said.
Yeah.
Where he's underperformed is, I think, the tax debate is not as far along as I think he might have hoped. I think similarly on healthcare, obviously, that's another big area where they're not on track.
Okay, yeah. Actually, one thing I didn't ask was where is infrastructure spend in all of this? You know, whether it's the Wednesday announcement or in terms of the first 100 days, has it kind of fallen to the wayside? Is this not a priority, or?
So I think coming into the inauguration and the initial phases, I think few people expected infrastructure to be part of the initial wave of things. This was something he talked about during the campaign, but it was pretty clear in the transition that this was something that was probably going to come after tax reform and a bunch of other things. So the fact that it hasn't advanced at this point, I don't think is a huge surprise. I will say that they don't seem to have made much progress on coming up with a practical strategy for advancing their infrastructure agenda. Trump has talked about it as an objective, but we just haven't made much progress on it.
Okay, no, that's great. Well, it should be an eventful week or so, so we'll all look forward to seeing that all. So thanks a lot, Lou, as usual, for giving us an update on the US picture. And for listeners to the podcast, all of Lou's views can be found in our weekly US economic publication that comes out on Fridays, and the occasional sort of intra-week piece as well. So thank you everyone for listening to the podcast. And our next podcast will be on our outlook and the developments in India.